The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as guard James Thompson adjusted his red uniform for what felt like the 1000th time. His tall black hat sat perfectly straight, his face a mask of stoic professionalism that had taken years to perfect. Tourists gathered around him, cameras clicking, children pointing and giggling at his stillness. What they didn't know was that behind those unblinking eyes, James was thinking about his 6-year-old daughter Emma's upcoming dance recital. She had been practicing her ballet routine for months, twirling around their small London apartment until she was dizzy with excitement. The recital was scheduled for the same evening he was supposed to work his shift, and he had been wrestling with disappointment for weeks. As the crowd thickened around him, a little girl with curly blonde hair broke away from her parents and approached him cautiously. She couldn't have been older than Emma, wearing a pink dress with sparkly shoes that caught the sunlight. The child stared up at him with wide, curious eyes, clearly fascinated by his impressive uniform and unwavering stance. "Mummy, why doesn't he move?" the little girl whispered loudly to her mother, who was fumbling with her camera nearby. Her mother shushed her gently, but James could hear every word. The innocent question reminded him of Emma's endless curiosity about his job, how she would pepper him with questions when he came home from his shifts. The little girl stepped closer, now just a few feet away from James. She tilted her head to one side, studying his face with the intense concentration that only children possess. Then, without warning, she did something that nearly broke his composure completely. She began to perform a clumsy but enthusiastic ballet routine right in front of him, her little arms raised above her head as she spun in circles. "Look, soldier man, I can dance like a princess," she declared proudly, completely oblivious to the growing crowd of amused onlookers who had stopped to watch her impromptu performance. Her parents looked mortified, rushing forward to collect their dancing daughter. But something magical was happening that none of them expected. For the first time in his 5-year career as a Queen's Guard, James Thompson felt his professional mask beginning to crack. The sight of this innocent child dancing with pure joy, completely uninhibited by the formal setting around her, transported him instantly to his own living room, where Emma would perform similar routines. His heart swelled with a mixture of pride and longing that threatened to overwhelm his rigid training. The little girl finished her dance with an elaborate bow, beaming up at James with such genuine happiness that several tourists in the crowd began to smile despite themselves. Her mother finally reached her, scooping her up with an apologetic look toward the guard, but the damage was already done. James could feel his eyes beginning to glisten, and he knew that his years of military discipline were about to be tested in a way he had never anticipated. As the family began to move away, the little dancer waved at James over her mother's shoulder. "Bye-bye, soldier man. Did you like my dance?" she called out cheerfully. The crowd waited with bated breath, cameras ready, sensing that something special was about to happen. James looked at this innocent child who had unknowingly connected with his deepest paternal emotions. And for a moment, the weight of protocol seemed less important than the weight of human connection. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones and shared across social media within hours. But more importantly, it would remind everyone present that beneath every uniform, behind every professional facade, beats the heart of someone who loves and is loved in return. The moment stretched like an eternity as James fought an internal battle between his duty and his heart. The little girl's innocent question hung in the air, and the crowd sensed something extraordinary was about to unfold. Then, almost imperceptibly, James did something that shocked everyone present. He gave the tiniest nod of his head and allowed the corners of his mouth to lift in the smallest, most gentle smile. The reaction was immediate and electric. The crowd gasped, phones started recording frantically, and the little girl clapped her hands together in pure delight. "He liked it, Mummy. The soldier man liked my dancing," she squealed with joy. But James wasn't finished. In a moment that would later be described as pure magic, he slowly and deliberately winked at the little dancer. The crowd erupted in warm applause, but what happened next surprised everyone even more. Other guards stationed around the palace grounds had witnessed the interaction, and one by one, they began to break their stoic poses in small but meaningful ways. Guard Michael Chen, stationed near the main gates, had been watching the scene unfold and thinking about his own 7-year-old son who had been asking him for weeks to teach him how to march like a soldier. When A young boy in the crowd began marching back and forth in front of Michael, trying to copy the guard's precise movements. Michael couldn't help but think of his son practicing in their backyard every evening after school. The boy's father was encouraging him, showing him how to keep his back straight and his steps even, and the sight stirred something deep in Michael's chest. Unable to resist, Michael broke protocol in his own subtle way. When the boy executed a particularly good marching sequence, Michael gave him a slow, approving thumbs up. The boy's face lit up like Christmas morning, and he ran to his father, jumping up and down with excitement. The father looked genuinely moved, mouthing thank you to the guard who had just made his son's day unforgettable. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, guard Sarah Williams was experiencing her own emotional moment. A teenage girl with obvious special needs had been standing quietly near her post for nearly 20 minutes, just watching Sarah with fascination and admiration. The girl's care worker explained that she dreamed of being a soldier one day, and had specifically asked to visit the palace to see the guards. Sarah thought about her younger brother, who also had learning disabilities, and how proud he always was when she told him stories about her work. The teenage girl suddenly began to salute Sarah repeatedly, her form imperfect but her enthusiasm boundless. After several minutes of watching this heartfelt display of respect and admiration, Sarah made a decision that would bring tears to many eyes. Very slowly and deliberately, Sarah returned the salute, holding it for several seconds while maintaining direct eye contact with the girl. The teenager's face transformed with pure joy and pride, and she began to cry happy tears. Her care worker was visibly emotional, explaining to nearby tourists that this was the first time the girl had ever received a salute back from a real soldier. The ripple effect of these spontaneous moments of humanity was spreading throughout the palace grounds. Tourists began sharing the videos on social media immediately, but more importantly, they were witnessing something profound about the human spirit. These guards, trained to be immovable and emotionless, were showing that beneath their uniforms beat hearts full of love, compassion, and connection to their own families. As the afternoon wore on, more guards found themselves in similar situations. Each interaction was unique, but they all shared the same common thread: the recognition that their roles as protectors and their identities as loving family members were not mutually exclusive. The palace grounds became a place where duty and heart merged in the most beautiful way possible. What started with one little girl's ballet dance was becoming a day that would change how people viewed not just the Queen's Guard, but the very nature of what it means to serve while remaining human. The most touching moments were yet to come, as families from around the world began to share their own stories of connection with these remarkable individuals who guard not just a palace, but the very ideals of dignity, service, and love. By late afternoon, news of the guards' heartwarming interactions had spread beyond the palace gates. Social media was buzzing with videos and photos, but the most powerful story was still unfolding in real time. Guard David Martinez had just received devastating news during his brief break. His elderly grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died, was in the hospital and asking for him. David had been scheduled to work until midnight, but his grandmother was the most important person in his life. She had sacrificed everything to send him to school, worked multiple jobs to support his dreams of serving his country, and had never missed a single important moment in his life. Now she was asking for him, and he was stuck in uniform, bound by duty and protocol. As he returned to his post with a heavy heart, a group of elderly tourists approached. Among them was a woman who looked remarkably similar to his grandmother, the same gentle eyes, the same warm smile, even the same way of holding her handbag. She was part of a senior citizen tour group visiting from Spain, and she had been watching David for several minutes with obvious admiration. The elderly woman approached slowly, using a walking cane for support. When she reached David's position, she stopped and said something in Spanish that he didn't understand, but her tone was unmistakably proud and grateful. Her granddaughter, who was accompanying her, translated with tears in her eyes. "She says you remind her of her grandson who died serving in the military," the young woman explained softly. "She wants to thank you for your service, and she says she's proud of you even though she doesn't know you. She says every mother and grandmother in the world is proud of young men like you who serve others." David felt his composure cracking. The old woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo of a young man in military uniform. She showed it to David, pointing to the photo, and then to him, nodding approvingly. Then she did something that nearly broke his heart completely. She reached up and gently straightened his uniform collar the same way his grandmother always did when he visited. Her unable to maintain his stoic facade any longer, David's eyes filled with tears. The elderly Spanish woman seemed to understand his emotional state instinctively. She patted his arm gently and said something else in Spanish. Her granddaughter translated again, her own voice breaking with emotion. She says she can see you have someone who loves you very much, and that person would want you to be strong, but also to never forget that love is the most important duty of all. At that moment, David made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He very slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With shaking hands, he showed the elderly woman a photo of his grandmother. Her face lit up with understanding and joy, and she nodded enthusiastically, pointing to the photo and then to her heart. The crowd that had gathered around this interaction was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. The elderly Spanish woman then did something extraordinary. She began to sing a soft lullaby in Spanish, the same type of song that grandmothers sing to their grandchildren all over the world. Her voice was gentle and melodious, filled with love and warmth. David couldn't hold back anymore. Tears streamed down his face as he listened to this stranger sing to him with the same tenderness his grandmother had shown him throughout his life. When she finished, she looked up at him and said one word in English that she had obviously practiced: family. David nodded, his professional training completely abandoned in favor of human connection. He whispered back, family, and the elderly woman smiled the most beautiful smile anyone in the crowd had ever seen. She reached up once more and touched his cheek gently, the way only a grandmother can do, and David knew that somehow his own grandmother's love was being channeled through this kind stranger. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, but more importantly, it was etched into the hearts of everyone present. They had just witnessed the power of love to transcend language, culture, and protocol. The elderly Spanish woman slowly walked away with her granddaughter, but not before turning back to wave at David one final time. He waved back, no longer caring who saw him break character, because he had learned something more valuable than any military training could teach: that love recognizes love, and family connections can happen between strangers in the most unexpected moments. As evening approached, the palace grounds had become something magical, a place where the rigid boundaries between duty and emotion had blurred into something beautiful and human. Guard Rebecca Foster was experiencing the most challenging moment of her military career, but not for any reason her training had prepared her for. A young military wife had approached her post with two small children, a toddler in a stroller, and a 5-year-old boy who was clutching a small British flag. The woman's eyes were red from crying, and she kept checking her phone nervously. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Excuse me," she said to Rebecca. "I know you can't respond, but I need to tell someone who might understand. My husband is deployed overseas, and we just found out his tour has been extended another 6 months. My little boy was supposed to see his daddy next week, and now—" Her voice broke completely. Rebecca's heart clenched. She had joined the military despite having no family military background, driven by a desire to serve. But standing there, listening to this woman's pain, she thought about all the military families she knew who made sacrifices every single day. The little boy was looking up at her with eyes full of confusion and disappointment. "Mummy said Daddy can't come home yet," the boy said directly to Rebecca, his small voice filled with the kind of sadness that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "She said soldiers like you understand why daddies have to stay away sometimes. Do you have to stay away from your family too?" The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She didn't have children of her own, but she had nieces and nephews who adored her, who counted down the days until her visits. She thought about all the family gatherings she had missed, all the birthday parties and school plays and bedtime stories that her duty had required her to sacrifice. The little boy stepped closer, still holding his flag. "My daddy has a uniform like yours, but it's green instead of red. He sends me pictures, but I want to hug him. Do you think he's brave like you?" The innocence and trust in his question was overwhelming. Rebecca felt tears threatening to spill over. Here was a child looking for comfort and understanding from a stranger in uniform, seeking reassurance that his father's sacrifice meant something. The boy's mother was watching hopefully, clearly desperate for any small gesture that might help her son feel better about his father's absence. Unable to maintain her stoic pose, Rebecca did something that surprised even herself. She slowly knelt down until she was at eye level with the little boy, completely abandoning her formal stance. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing that something profound was happening. "Your daddy is the bravest person I know," she whispered softly, her voice filled with emotion. "And so are you, and so is your mummy. Being brave doesn't mean you don't feel sad sometimes. It means you keep loving each other even when it's hard." The little boy's eyes widened with wonder. Here was a real soldier, talking to him like he was important, like his feelings mattered. "Really? Daddy says I have to be the man of the house while he's gone. Is that what brave boys do?" Rebecca's heart broke for this child carrying such a heavy burden. She reached out and gently straightened his little shirt, the same caring gesture she had seen mothers do 1,000 times. Being brave means being loving and kind and helping your mummy when you can. But you're still allowed to be a little boy who misses his daddy. That's not weak, that's human. The boy's mother was crying openly now, not from sadness but from gratitude. Here was a stranger showing her son the compassion and understanding she had been struggling to provide alone. Other tourists had stopped to watch, many of them visibly moved by the interaction. Rebecca reached into her pocket and pulled out a small British flag pin from her uniform. She had been saving it for her nephew's upcoming birthday, but something told her it needed to go to this little boy instead. "This is from my uniform," she said, carefully pinning it to his shirt. "Every time you look at it, remember that your daddy and I and all the other soldiers are connected. We're all part of the same family of people who serve, and that makes you part of that family too." The little boy looked down at the pin with awe, then back up at Rebecca. Without warning, he threw his small arms around her neck in the most heartfelt hug she had ever received. "Thank you for taking care of my daddy's family," he whispered in her ear. And Rebecca realized that this child understood something profound about service and sacrifice that many adults never grasp. As she hugged him back, Rebecca understood that she wasn't just a guard standing at attention anymore. She was a representative of every service member who had ever been away from home, and she had just helped bridge the gap between a child's confusion and understanding. As the sun began to set over Buckingham Palace, creating a golden glow across the ancient stones, something unprecedented was happening. Senior Guard Captain William Hayes, a veteran of 15 years who had never once broken protocol, was about to face the most emotionally challenging moment of his entire career. A couple in their 70s had been standing near his post for almost an hour, and he couldn't help but notice the woman was wearing a military widow's pin on her coat. They had been talking quietly, pointing occasionally at the palace and at him, clearly engaged in some kind of meaningful conversation. Finally, the man approached him with obvious nervousness. "Sir," the elderly man said formally, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but my wife has something she needs to say to you. Our son served in Afghanistan. He didn't make it home." The man's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Captain Hayes felt his professional composure being tested immediately. The woman stepped forward slowly, her hand shaking slightly as she reached into her purse. She pulled out a folded letter that was clearly worn from being handled many times. "This is the last letter our boy wrote to us," she said softly. "He talked about soldiers like you, about duty and honor and serving something bigger than yourself. He said he hoped that one day, if he made it home, he could stand where you're standing now." Captain Hayes felt his throat tighten. In 15 years of service, he had perfected the art of emotional control, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The woman continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I know you can't respond, but I needed to tell someone in uniform that our son's sacrifice meant something. He believed in what you represent, the idea that some things are worth protecting, worth serving, worth giving everything for. When I see you standing here, I see him." The woman's husband put his arm around her shoulders as she began to cry softly. "We come here every year on the anniversary of his death," he explained. "Not to be sad, but to remember what he believed in. To see young people like you still willing to serve and protect others." Captain Hayes felt something breaking inside his chest. He thought about his own parents who worried about him every day he put on this uniform. He thought about all the families who had lost sons and daughters in service to their country, and how their grief was transformed into gratitude for those who continued to serve. The elderly woman looked up at him with eyes that held both immense sadness and incredible strength. "Would it be terribly wrong to ask you for just one small favor?" she asked hesitantly. Could you just nod if you think our son would be proud of soldiers like you? I know it's against the rules, but Captain Hayes looked at this grieving mother who had found a way to honor her son's memory by connecting with a stranger in uniform. He thought about the letter she clutched in her hands, about the son who had dreamed of standing in his place, about the ultimate sacrifice that made his own service possible. For the first time in his 15-year career, Captain Hayes made a conscious decision to put humanity above protocol. Very slowly and deliberately he nodded. But he didn't stop there. He removed his hat and held it over his heart in a gesture of respect that left everyone watching completely speechless. The woman gasped and pressed the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely now. Her husband straightened to attention and saluted Captain Hayes, holding the salute until the captain, still holding his hat over his heart, saluted back. The moment stretched between them, filled with honor, respect, and shared understanding of sacrifice. Other guards around the palace grounds had witnessed the exchange, and one by one, they too removed their hats and held them over their hearts. Tourists stopped taking pictures and instead stood in respectful silence, instinctively understanding they were witnessing something sacred, a moment where grief met gratitude, where loss met legacy, where the past connected with the present through service and honor. The elderly woman walked slowly up to Captain Hayes and gently placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping me feel close to him again. Thank you for showing me that his dreams live on in people like you." As the couple walked away, the woman turned back one final time. She held up the letter and smiled through her tears, and Captain Hayes knew that he had just participated in something far more important than any military ceremony he had ever attended. He had helped a mother honor her son, and in doing so, had honored every person who had ever worn a uniform in service to others. The golden sunset cast long shadows across the palace grounds, and for the first time in his career, Captain Hayes understood that the greatest act of service sometimes means choosing love over protocol, connection over conformity, and humanity over military bearing. As the palace lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, something extraordinary was culminating that had started with a little girl's ballet dance hours earlier. The day's events had been captured and shared across social media platforms worldwide, but the most powerful transformation was happening right there on the palace grounds as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Guard James Thompson, whose interaction with the young dancer had started it all, was preparing for the end of his shift when he received an unexpected message. His commanding officer had been monitoring the day's events and the unprecedented positive response from the public. Instead of facing disciplinary action for breaking protocol, James was told that his daughter Emma's dance recital had been rescheduled to accommodate his duty schedule. The theater director had seen the viral videos and wanted to honor a father who had shown the world that service and love could coexist beautifully. As the evening ceremony began, something magical happened. The families who had connected with the guards throughout the day had stayed to watch the changing of the guard. But they weren't just spectators anymore. They had become part of an extended family bound together by shared moments of human connection. The little Spanish grandmother, who had comforted Guard Martinez, was there with her granddaughter waving a small British flag. The military wife and her children had remained as well, the little boy proudly wearing Rebecca's flag pin and explaining to anyone who would listen that he was part of the soldier family now. The elderly couple who had shared their son's letter with Captain Hayes stood at attention, holding hands and watching with tears of pride rather than sorrow. As the new guards marched in with their characteristic precision, something unprecedented happened. Captain Hayes, who was leading the ceremony, made eye contact with each of the families who had touched the guards' hearts that day. Then, in a moment that would be remembered forever, he made a subtle gesture that acknowledged each of them, a slight nod to the elderly couple, a gentle smile toward the little boy with the flag pin, a respectful bow of his head to the Spanish grandmother. The crowd understood that they were witnessing history, not the changing of the guard, but the changing of what it meant to serve with both duty and heart. The ceremony continued with all its traditional pomp and precision, but now it carried an additional layer of meaning. These weren't just soldiers performing a ritual. They were human beings who had chosen to protect and serve while maintaining their capacity for love, compassion, and connection. As the ceremony concluded and the day shift guards prepared to leave, something beautiful happened spontaneously. The families began to applaud, but it wasn't the polite tourist applause that usually accompanied these ceremonies. It was the kind of heartfelt appreciation that comes from genuine connection and mutual respect. Guard Thompson walked past the little girl who had danced for him earlier. She ran up to him one final time and whispered, "Will you tell your little girl that the dancing princess said hello?" James knelt down and whispered back, "I will, and she's going to love hearing about the brave little dancer who made her daddy smile." Rebecca found herself surrounded by military families who had heard about her interaction with the deployed father's family. They thanked her not just for her service, but for understanding their struggles and showing kindness to a child who needed it. She realized that her uniform represented not just duty to country, but responsibility to the families who sacrifice alongside those who serve. Guard Martinez received a text from his grandmother's nurse. She was stable and asking about his day. When he told her about the Spanish grandmother who had sung to him, his own grandmother laughed and said, "Mijo, love travels through grandmothers all over the world. That woman was my heart reaching out to yours." As the guards walked away from the palace grounds, they were different people than they had been that morning. They had learned that their greatest strength wasn't in their ability to remain emotionless and still, but in their capacity to serve with both professionalism and humanity. They had discovered that breaking character didn't mean breaking faith with their duties. It meant expanding their understanding of what service truly means. The videos and photos from that day would be shared millions of times, but their impact went far deeper than social media metrics. They reminded the world that behind every uniform is a person with a family, dreams, fears, and an enormous capacity for love. They showed that true strength comes not from suppressing emotion, but from choosing when and how to express it with dignity and purpose. Years later, the families from that day would still remember their connections with the guards. The little girl who danced would become a ballet teacher who always told her students that courage and grace go hand in hand. The little boy with the flag pin would grow up to serve in the military himself, always remembering that strength includes compassion. The elderly couples would continue visiting the palace, but now they came not as strangers, but as part of an extended family that understood the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and love. The royal guards had always protected more than just a building or a person. They protected ideals, traditions, and values. But on this particular day, they had protected something even more precious: the understanding that duty and love are not opposites, but partners in the greatest service of all, caring for one another as fellow human beings sharing this brief, beautiful journey through life.